The pregnancy test trembled in Brianna's hands like a death sentence. 2 pink lines stared back at her, 2 lines that would either destroy everything she'd ever known or teach her what grace really means. But first, she had to survive the storm that was coming. The morning sun streamed through Brianna's bedroom window, but all she could see was darkness. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since that party. 3 weeks since she made the biggest mistake of her 17-year-old life. And now, staring at the plastic stick in her shaking hands, she knew her world was about to crumble. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silent house. The 2 pink lines seemed to mock her, growing clearer by the second. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. Not to the preacher's daughter who taught Sunday school and led worship with a voice that made angels weep. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Her father's morning routine. Coffee first, then his daily Bible reading before heading to the church office. Brianna stuffed the test deep into her backpack, her heart hammering so loud she was sure he could hear it through the walls. "Bree, you up, sweetheart? Don't want to be late for school." "Coming, Dad," she called back, her voice cracking. She stared at her reflection in the mirror. Same brown eyes, same gentle smile that everyone at Riverside Community Church knew and loved. But behind those eyes, a secret was already eating her alive. 20 minutes later, she sat in the passenger seat of her father's truck, watching him hum along to the Christian radio station. Pastor James Winters, beloved by his congregation, respected in their small town, and completely unaware that his perfect daughter was carrying the weight of the world in her backpack. "You're quiet this morning," he said, glancing at her with those kind eyes that had comforted countless parishioners through their darkest moments. "Just tired," she lied, the word burning her throat like poison. It was her first lie. It wouldn't be her last.
"3 days. Brianna had kept the secret for 3 days, and it was already killing her from the inside out. She sat in AP biology, staring at the chapter on human reproduction while her classmates took notes, completely unaware that their star student was living the very lesson they were studying. "Miss Winters?" Mrs. Blake's voice cut through her thoughts. "Can you explain the process of fertilization?" The irony wasn't lost on her. When a sperm cell penetrates an egg cell, creating a zygote that implants in the uterine wall," she recited mechanically. Excellent, as always. If only she knew. That afternoon, youth group felt like torture. Pastor Mike stood at the front of the church basement, his voice passionate as he spoke about purity and God's plan for relationships. 23 teenagers hung on his every word, including Brianna's best friend Emma, who nodded enthusiastically beside her. "Your body is a temple," Pastor Mike declared. "Don't let anyone convince you that what you do with it doesn't matter. Every choice has consequences." Brianna's stomach lurched. She excused herself to the bathroom, barely making it before the nausea hit. Morning sickness, she realized, another reminder of the life growing inside her. When she returned, Emma was waiting in the hallway. "You okay? You've been acting weird lately." "I'm fine, just fighting off a bug." Another lie. They were getting easier. That night at dinner, her mother asked about college applications. "The deadline for the Christian colleges is coming up. Have you finished your essays?" Brianna pushed food around her plate. How could she write about her calling to ministry when she couldn't even look her parents in the eye? "Still working on them." "Well, don't wait too long. With your grades and your father's recommendation, you're sure to get into any program you want." The weight of their expectations pressed down on her chest like a boulder. Perfect grades, perfect behavior, perfect future. Everything she was about to destroy. After dinner, she locked herself in her room and pulled out her phone. She stared at the contact for the pregnancy clinic across town. She'd looked it up during lunch, memorizing the address and phone number, but every time she tried to call, her finger froze over the screen. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Bree?" Her father's voice was gentle. "Can I come in?" She shoved the phone under her pillow. "Sure, Dad." He sat on the edge of her bed, his presence both comforting and terrifying. "I know something's bothering you. You know you can tell me anything, right?" For a moment, she almost broke. The words were right there, desperate to escape. But then she remembered the disappointment in his eyes when the church secretary got divorced, the sermon he'd preached about the consequences of sin, the way he'd shaken his head sadly when discussing teenage pregnancy statistics. "I'm just stressed about school," she whispered. He squeezed her hand. "My strong girl, whatever it is, God will see you through it." If only she believed that anymore.
2 weeks later, the lies were multiplying like weeds. Brianna had become a master of deception, crafting elaborate stories to explain away her nausea, her fatigue, her inability to concentrate. She told her teacher she had the flu. She told her friends she was fighting depression. She told her parents she was overwhelmed with college prep. Everyone believed her because she was Brianna Winters, the girl who never lied. But the cracks were starting to show. In English class, they were reading The Scarlet Letter. The irony was suffocating. As her teacher discussed Hester Prynne's shame and society's judgment, Brianna felt every word like a dagger to her heart. What do you think, Brianna? How does Hester's situation relate to modern society? The question hung in the air. 20 pairs of eyes turned to her, waiting for the insightful answer she always gave. But all she could think about was the scarlet letter she would soon be wearing, not embroidered on her chest, but growing in her belly. I think, her voice faltered. The room began to spin. She gripped her desk, fighting off another wave of nausea. I think she was brave. Her teacher raised her eyebrow, clearly expecting more, but moved on to another student. After class, her best friend Emma cornered her at her locker. Okay, what's really going on? You've been a ghost for weeks. You barely talk to anyone anymore. You won't hang out after school. And don't tell me you're still fighting that bug because no flu lasts 3 weeks. Brianna slammed her locker shut harder than necessary. I'm fine, Emma. Just leave it alone. No, I won't leave it alone. Emma's voice echoed down the empty hallway. You're my best friend. We tell each other everything. Remember when I was cutting myself sophomore year? You didn't leave me alone then. The comparison hit like a physical blow. Emma was right. They had always been there for each other. But this was different. This would change everything. Please, Brianna's voice broke. Just trust me. I can't talk about it right now. Emma's expression softened, but hurt flickered in her eyes. Fine, but I'm here when you're ready. As Emma walked away, Brianna felt another piece of her world crumble. She was losing everyone, one lie at a time. That evening at dinner, the facade became even harder to maintain. Her mother had made her favorite meal, chicken parmesan with garlic bread. The smell that once made her mouth water now made her stomach revolt. You're not eating much, her mother observed. Not that hungry, Brianna mumbled, pushing the food around her plate. Maybe you should see Dr. Peterson. This bug you've had seems to be lingering. Panic shot through her chest. No, I'm fine. It's just stress. Senior year, you know. Her parents exchanged glances across the table. She could see the worry in their eyes, and it made her feel even worse. Later that night, she stood in front of her bedroom mirror, lifting her shirt to examine her still flat stomach. How much longer could she hide this? How much longer before everyone knew what she'd done? She thought about the party that started it all. Jake Morrison's house, his parents out of town. She'd never been the party type, but Emma had convinced her to go. Live a little, she had said. You're always so perfect. Perfect. The word tasted bitter now. She'd had too much to drink, something she'd never done before. Jake had been charming, telling her she was beautiful, that she was different from other girls. In her altered state, his words had felt like poetry. The next morning, reality crashed in like a tsunami. Now, staring at her reflection, she barely recognized the girl looking back. The light in her eyes had dimmed. The confident smile was gone. She was becoming someone she didn't know, someone built on lies and secrets. A text from Emma lit up her phone. I love you, no matter what. Remember that. Tears burned her eyes. If only Emma knew how much those words meant, and how impossible they felt to believe. The collapse came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after that night at Jake's party. Brianna had barely slept the night before. The weight of keeping her secret was crushing her spirit, and her body was starting to rebel in ways she couldn't hide. She'd thrown up twice before breakfast, had to sit down 3 times while getting dressed, and nearly fainted in the shower. But she had a calculus test third period. She couldn't miss it. The morning started normally enough. Her father dropped her off with his usual kiss on the forehead and reminder to make good choices. If only he knew that ship had already sailed. First period English went smoothly. Second period history was a blur of dates and facts that she couldn't concentrate on. But by third period, the room was spinning before she even sat down. Mrs. Chen was writing complex equations on the board when it happened. Brianna was trying to copy the problems into her notebook when black spots began dancing in her vision. Her hands started shaking. The room tilted sideways. "I can't. I need," she whispered to herself, gripping her desk. The last thing she remembered was the sound of her chair scraping against the floor as she tried to stand. Then darkness swallowed her whole. She woke up in the nurse's office with three faces staring down at her: Mrs. Chen, the nurse Mrs. Lopez, and Principal Anderson. Their expressions ranged from concern to suspicious. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Mrs. Lopez asked gently. "Dizzy," Brianna admitted, struggling to sit up. "When was your last period, honey?" The question hit her like ice water. Mrs. Lopez wasn't just any nurse. She was the mother of 4 and had seen it all. The knowing look in her eyes made Brianna's stomach drop. What do you mean?" "Brianna," Mrs. Lopez's voice was kind but firm, "I need to ask your parents to come in. There are some things we need to discuss." "No!" The word exploded from her mouth. "You can't call them, please. I'm fine. It was just low blood sugar or something." But it was too late. Principal Anderson was already reaching for the phone. 25 minutes later, both her parents burst through the nurse's office door. Her mother immediately wrapped her in a crushing hug while her father's eyes swept the room, trying to assess the situation. "What happened?" her mother demanded. "Is she hurt?" Mrs. Lopez gestured for them to sit down. "Mr. and Mrs. Winters, I'm afraid there's something you need to know." The next few minutes passed in a blur of medical explanations, shocked silence, and the sound of her mother crying. Brianna watched her father's face transform from concern to confusion to devastating understanding. "Pregnant," he whispered, as if saying the word louder would make it more real. Brianna couldn't look at him. She stared at the motivational posters on the nurse's office walls. "Believe in yourself," and "Every day is a new opportunity," and wondered if she'd ever feel hopeful about anything again. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of her life. Her mother cried silently in the passenger seat while her father gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. Nobody spoke. At home, they sat in the living room, the same room where they'd celebrated her acceptance to the National Honor Society, where she'd practiced her piano recitals, where they'd had family devotions every Sunday evening. "How long have you known?" Her father's voice was barely above a whisper. 3 weeks, she admitted. 3 weeks, he repeated the words like they were foreign. 3 weeks, you've been lying to us. The disappointment in his voice was worse than if he'd screamed. This was the man who had taught her that honesty was the foundation of faith, that integrity was more valuable than gold, and she had looked him in the eye every day for 3 weeks and lied. "Who?" her mother asked through her tears. Brianna closed her eyes. "Jake Morrison." Her father's jaw tightened. "Jake's family attended our church. His parents are in the choir. This wasn't just a teenage mistake. It would be a church scandal." "Does he know?" her father asked. She shook her head. For the next hour, they talked about options, possibilities, and consequences. The conversation was clinical and painful, filled with words like adoption and reputation and future. Through it all, Brianna felt like she was watching someone else's life fall apart. Finally, her father stood up. "I need some time to think, to pray." He looked at her with eyes full of pain. "I love you, Brianna, but I'm disappointed. Not just about the pregnancy, about the lies. We taught you better than that." Those words followed her to her room, where she finally allowed herself to break down completely. Everything she'd feared had happened. Her secret was out, her parents were devastated, and her perfect life was in ruins. But somehow, underneath the pain and shame, there was also a strange sense of relief. The exhausting weight of keeping secrets was finally gone. Now she just had to figure out how to put the pieces back together. Sunday morning came like a death march. For 3 days, Brianna had been living in a prison of silence and shame. Her parents barely spoke to her except to discuss logistics, doctor appointments, school counselors, and the dreaded conversation with Jake's parents that was scheduled for Sunday afternoon. She hadn't been to school since the fainting incident. The official story was that she had mono and needed rest, but she knew the truth would spread soon enough. Small towns had no secrets, especially when they involved the preacher's daughter. "You're coming to church," her father announced at breakfast. His voice was tired, aged by days of prayer and anguish. "Dad, I can't. Everyone will know. They'll stare." "No one knows anything yet," her mother said quietly. "And even if they did, running away isn't the answer." So there she sat, in the third pew, same as every Sunday for the past 17 years. But everything felt different. The familiar hymns sounded hollow. The prayers felt like they were bouncing off the ceiling, and when her father stepped up to the pulpit, she wanted to disappear into the floor. Pastor James Winters looked out over his congregation. People who trusted him, respected him, looked to him for guidance. Brianna could see the weight of the past few days etched in the lines around his eyes. "This morning," he began, his voice was stronger than she'd heard it all week, "I want to talk about condemnation." Brianna's heart sank. Here it comes, she thought, the sermon about consequences and sin and falling short of God's glory. The congregation would put the pieces together. They'd know he was talking about her. But then something unexpected happened. "Romans 8:1, her father continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus." He looked directly at her for just a moment, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Love. Not disappointment, not shame, but pure, unconditional love. "I've been a pastor for 22 years, and in that time, I've seen people make mistakes. I've seen teenagers struggle with choices they regret. I've seen families torn apart by secrets and shame. But I've also seen something even more powerful. I've seen grace." The congregation was silent, hanging on every word. Mrs. Patterson nodded encouragingly. Mr. Lopez wiped his eyes. Even the teenagers in the back row were paying attention. "Some of you are sitting in these pews today carrying burdens you think are too heavy for God to lift. Some of you are drowning in shame, convinced that you've gone too far, fallen too hard, messed up too badly for redemption." Brianna's eyes filled with tears. It was as if he was speaking directly to her heart. "But I'm here to tell you this morning, shame is a liar. Shame says you're finished. Shame says you're beyond hope. Shame says God could never love someone like you." His voice cracked with emotion. "But God says something different. God says you're forgiven. God says you're loved. God says you're not defined by your worst moment." The word that washed over her like warm rain after a drought. She looked around the sanctuary and saw nodding heads, tearful eyes, and hearts being touched by the message of grace. In John chapter 8, religious leaders brought a woman caught in adultery to Jesus. They wanted to stone her. That was the law. But Jesus looked at her accusers and said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." One by one, they walked away. And when they were gone, Jesus looked at this broken, ashamed woman and said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Brianna could barely see through her tears now. She felt her mother's hand slip into hers, squeezing gently. Church, we are not in the business of throwing stones. We are in the business of offering hope. We are not here to condemn. We are here to restore. Because the truth, God's truth, sets us free. When the service ended, something has shifted in the sanctuary. People hugged a little longer, smiled a little warmer, looked at each other with greater compassion. And several people stopped by the Winters family to shake her father's hand and tell him it was exactly what they needed to hear. On the drive home, her father caught her eyes in the rearview mirror. He said, "That sermon, I wrote it 3 weeks ago before I knew about your situation. God knew what we were going to need to hear." That afternoon, Brianna sat on her bed rereading John 8, 10, and 11, the woman caught in adultery, the crowd ready with stones, Jesus drawing in the dirt, and those beautiful words, "Neither do I condemn you." For the first time in weeks, She felt something she thought she'd lost forever: hope. The conversation with Jake's parents was every bit as awkward as Brianna had imagined. The Morrisons sat stiffly on the Winters' living room couch, their faces ranging from shocked to disappointed to angry. Jake slumped in the chair across from Brianna, unable to meet her eyes. "We're very sorry this happened," Mrs. Morrison said, though her tone suggested she blamed Brianna entirely. "Jake told us it was just one time and that you both had been drinking." "It was," Brianna said quietly. "We both made a mistake." Mr. Morrison cleared his throat. "Well, we need to discuss what happens next. Jake has a scholarship to State University. He can't let this derail his future." The implication hung heavy in the air. Brianna was on her own. "We're not asking Jake to give up his dreams," her father said carefully, "but he does need to take responsibility for his part in this." Jake finally spoke up. "I'll help with money if that's what you want, but I'm not ready to be a dad." Looking at him now, this boy who had seemed so charming at the party, so mature and confident, she saw him for what he really was: a scared 18-year-old who wanted to run away from consequences just as much as she had. "No one's asking you to be ready," she heard herself saying, "but this baby exists whether we're ready or not." The room fell silent. It was the first time she'd said the word baby out loud, and something shifted inside her as she did. This wasn't just a problem to be solved or a mistake to be hidden. This was a life. After the Morrisons left, with promises of financial support but little else, Brianna's family sat in their living room, facing the biggest decision of their lives. "You have options," her mother said gently. "There are couples who would love to adopt. You could finish school, go to college, live your life. Or," her father added, "you could keep the baby. It would be hard, harder than you can imagine, but we would support you either way." Brianna spent the next week wrestling with the decision. She researched adoption agencies and read testimonies from birth mothers. She looked at college brochures and tried to imagine her life continuing as planned. She prayed until her knees were sore and her heart was raw. But every time she placed her hand on her still flat stomach, she felt something she couldn't explain. Not just the physical reality of pregnancy, but a connection, a purpose. The deciding moment came during her first doctor's appointment. Dr. Mitchell performed an ultrasound. On the grainy black and white screen, Brianna saw a tiny shape that looked more like a bean than a baby. "There's the heartbeat," Dr. Mitchell said, pointing to a rapid fluttering on the screen. The sound filled the room. Fast, strong, determined, like this tiny life was fighting to exist. "Can I have a copy of the picture?" Brianna whispered. That evening, she called a family meeting. Her parents sat on the couch, their faces carefully neutral, waiting for her decision. "I'm keeping the baby," she said simply. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, not of disappointment, but of love and pride. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." She held up the ultrasound picture. "This is my child. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I know I have to try." Her father stood up and pulled her into the tightest hug of her life. "Then we'll figure it out together." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. They met with the school counselor about continuing her education. They researched parenting classes and childcare options. They began the difficult process of telling extended family and close church friends. The reactions were mixed. Some people were supportive and encouraging. Others whispered behind their backs or offered unsolicited advice. A few families quietly distanced themselves, as if teenage pregnancy might be contagious. But through it all, Brianna discovered something amazing. She was stronger than she thought. Each judgmental look made her more determined to prove them wrong. Each whispered comment fueled her resolve to be the best mother she could be. She also discovered who her real friends were. Emma stood by her without question, even helping her research maternity clothes and baby supplies. Several other friends rallied around her, forming a support system she hadn't expected. It was during this time that Brianna had an idea that would change everything. She was sitting in the school counselor's office discussing her modified class schedule when she overheard a conversation in the hallway. Two girls were talking about a classmate who had gotten in trouble and dropped out of school. "That's the third one this year," one girl said. "It's so sad. They just
disappear and you never see them again. That's when it hit her. She wasn't the only one. There were other girls facing the same fear, the same shame, the same impossible choices. Girls who were suffering in silence because they didn't know where to turn. That night, she approached her parents with a proposal that would transform her pain into purpose. "I want to start a support group," she said, "for girls like me, girls who need to know they're not alone." Her father smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him in weeks. "That sounds like something Jesus would do."
The first meeting of Grace Girls happened in the Winters family basement on a Thursday evening in February. Brianna had spent weeks preparing, her heart pounding with anxiety and hope in equal measure. Only 3 girls showed up that first night. There was Ashley, a sophomore who was 12 weeks pregnant and terrified to tell her parents. Maria, a junior whose boyfriend had abandoned her the moment she told him the news. And Jennifer, a senior who was considering dropping out because she couldn't handle the whispers in the hallway. They sat in the circle on folding chairs, sharing stories and tears over hot chocolate and store-bought cookies. For 2 hours, they talked about their fears, their dreams, and their determination to prove that teenage pregnancy didn't have to mean the end of their futures. "I thought I was the only one," Ashley whispered through her tears. "I thought I was the only person who ever made such a stupid mistake." "You're not stupid," Brianna said firmly. "We made choices we regret, but that doesn't make us stupid. It makes us human." By the end of the evening, something beautiful had happened. 3 girls who had walked in feeling alone and ashamed left knowing they had sisters who understood their journey. Word spread quietly through the school. By the 4th meeting, they had 8 girls. By the end of the month, 12. Girls at different stages of pregnancy, girls who had already given birth, and even some who had chosen adoption but needed ongoing support. They called themselves Grace Girls because, as Brianna explained, grace isn't something you earn, it's something you receive. And once you receive it, you can't help but share it. The group wasn't just about pregnancy support. They studied together, celebrated each other's achievements, and proved that teenage mothers could excel academically. Brianna finished her senior year with a 3.8 GPA. Ashley made honor roll despite missing school for morning sickness. Maria got accepted to community college with plans to transfer to a 4-year university. As Brianna's pregnancy progressed, she became a living testimony to the power of grace over shame. She walked the school hallways with her head held high, her growing belly a visible reminder that she had chosen life and love over fear. The baby shower, organized by her church family, was one of the most beautiful events she'd ever experienced. Women who had initially whispered about her now showered her with gifts, advice, and encouragement. Mrs. Patterson, the church organist, pulled her aside with tears in her eyes. "Honey," she said, "you've taught this whole church what grace looks like in action. We needed that lesson more than you know." When Grace Girls was featured in the local newspaper, Local Teen Turns Personal Struggle into Support System, Brianna realized her story had grown beyond her small town. Letters arrived from other young mothers across the state, thanking her for showing them they weren't alone. The birth of baby Hope Winters on a sunny day in September was the culmination of a journey that had begun in shame and fear, but had transformed into something beautiful. As Brianna held her daughter for the first time, surrounded by her family and closest friends, she marveled at how far she'd come. "She's perfect," her father whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks as he held his granddaughter. "Absolutely perfect." 6 months later, Brianna stood before her church congregation once again. But this time, she wasn't sitting in the pew. She was at the podium sharing her testimony. "A year ago," she began, her voice strong and clear, "I thought my life was over. I thought I had fallen too far, failed too completely for God to ever use me again. But God had different plans." She looked out over the congregation, at faces that had watched her grow up, had witnessed her fall and seen her rise again. In the front row, Emma held baby Hope while Brianna spoke. In the third row, several of her Grace Girls sat with their own children, living proof that teenage pregnancy didn't have to derail dreams. She learned that shame is a liar. Shame says you're finished. Shame says you're beyond redemption. But God says something different. God says you're forgiven. God says you're loved. And God says you're not defined by your worst moment. You're defined by His grace. She paused, looking directly at a teenage girl in the back row who looked terrified and alone.
Some of you might be sitting in these pews today carrying secrets you think are too heavy for God to handle. You might think you've messed up too badly to ever be used by Him again. But I'm here to tell you that's a lie. Her voice rose with passion and conviction. The truth is this: God specializes in redemption stories. He takes our messes and turns them into messages. He takes our pain and transforms it into purpose, and He takes our shame and replaces it with grace. The congregation was silent, but it wasn't the silence of judgment. It was the silence of hearts being touched, of lives being changed by her words. Jesus said in John 8:11, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." But He also said something else. He said the truth will set you free. The truth isn't just about confessing our mistakes. The truth is about accepting God's grace and letting it transform us. As Brianna concluded her testimony, she saw tears and eyes throughout the sanctuary. After the service, person after person approached her, some to thank her, others to share their own stories of redemption, and a few teenage girls to ask about Grace Girls. 1 year later, Grace Girls had expanded to 3 neighboring towns. Brianna had started college part-time, studying social work with plans to help at-risk youth. Baby Hope was walking and babbling mama and dada to anyone who would listen. And Jake Morrison, who had initially run from responsibility, had begun visiting regularly and contributing to his daughter's care. But perhaps the most beautiful transformation was in Brianna herself. The girl who had once hidden shame had become a young woman who radiated grace. She spoke at youth conferences, mentored teenage mothers, and had even been invited to share her story at the state capitol during a discussion about teen pregnancy prevention and support. Standing in her childhood bedroom one evening, now transformed into a nursery, Brianna reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The pregnancy test that once felt like a death sentence now seemed like the beginning of her real life. The lies that had once consumed her had been replaced by a commitment to radical honesty. The shame that had nearly destroyed her had been transformed into a platform for grace. Outside her window, the lights of Riverside Community Church glowed in the darkness, no longer a symbol of judgment and expectation, but a beacon of hope and redemption. The girl who had thought her life was over at 17 had discovered something beautiful. Sometimes God's greatest plans begin with our biggest mistakes. Sometimes grace grows brightest in the soil of shame. And sometimes the very thing that threatens to destroy us becomes the foundation for our purpose. And so Brianna Winters learned what millions before her had discovered, that our greatest failures can become our most powerful testimonies, that shame says you're finished, but God says you're forgiven, and that the truth, however painful, really does set us free. Her story didn't end with a perfect life, it ended with a redeemed one. A life that proved that teenage pregnancy didn't have to mean the end of dreams, but can become the beginning of purpose. A life that showed that grace is stronger than shame, love is more powerful than judgment, and truth is the key to freedom. Because the truth remains, shame says you're finished, God says you're forgiven, and truth, God's truth, sets us free.